Hey, how's it going? This is Colton Udall from Champion Adventures. Today I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step process on how to install your Champion Adventures Coolant Outlet Kit on your 2019 CRF 450X and maybe your CRF 450L. Okay, the first step to doing your coolant outlet kit, basically you need to take the skid plate off. So after you get both side covers off, I like to take the seat cradle off, which has the ECU connected to it, so the tank has plenty of room to move around. We'll start with these side bolts here. Again, a lot of this is all just 8mm bolts. And pretty much the torque spec for all 8mm bolts is 84 inch-pounds. So after I've got this, basically both bolts are loose, I'll grab these pieces and they're just pinched on. So you just pull sideways and lift. Pull sideways. They're kind of tough. So the seat cradle comes loose. Then you push this, it's basically a starter relay, down out of the plug harness, and this whole piece comes out to the side. Now you can get to the tank. There's basically bolts, 2 bolts down here at the bottom and 1 up here at the top. Okay, after you get to the 3 tank bolts off, you're going to basically separate the connection here to the overflow hose, and then there's 1 connector here that kind of just holds the piece to the throttle cables. You'll lift the tank out of its cradle. This is kind of a technical part. There's 1 electrical connector here. I use just a real small flat blade screwdriver, but I squeeze the connector and it comes right off. It just has 1 squeeze piece here, and then I pull this plastic piece off. Don't lose that. There's a small green connector in here. You just use both your fingers and pull out. You don't need to pull it all the way out, just out enough till it pops once. Then pull back and the fuel hose connector will come out. Now you have one more thing. This is hard to see, but it's just a basic clip, and if you get under here, you can use your flat blade and use one side, and that clip will come right out. You won't damage it if you just put pressure with the flat blade on the inside, and the thing will come out. The tank comes right out. Okay, after you remove the tank, you're going to remove the exhaust. There's 2 12mm bolts here, a 10mm here, which is a clamp, 10mm here, and a 10mm here. Last thing, the 2 headers, 8mm bolts. A lot of times people don't replace the exhaust gasket that sits in here. If you're using the same exhaust, sometimes I reuse it. If I put a brand new exhaust on, this circumference sometimes is a little different, and you don't want to create a lean backfire by not having a perfect seal. So it's best to use a new exhaust gasket, but if you don't have one, it's not really that big of a deal. Here's your coolant basically drain. You'll know that because it has a brass crush washer. So you take your container of any type. You can use a funnel. I don't really like it because it's just another component. Now it's obviously not coming out. You have to pop the radiator cap because the seals really well, and the coolant will come out. Once you have the coolant drained, it's important to put the coolant drain bolt back in. It's an 8mm head with a 6mm thread. I always like to retorque it to the 84 inch-pounds. That way you don't ever have to remember. Once you're done, you don't forget it, Next step's to loosen all the radiator hoses. I've loosened most of these just for convenience of the video. Slide them up so that they kind of come out of the way. One of the best things to use to get your radiator hoses off, normally they're really stuck. I always use like a real small flat blade screwdriver and just get it inside and kind of move it around the inner part. You don't want to like scratch anything, but once that happens, you can kind of shimmy the radiator hoses off. It seems like they are pretty sticky at first. Next, you'll remove the coolant temperature sensor. It's just a squeeze plug. Squeeze right on the tab here and then move back. Comes right off. Here's another, this is like basically a relay plug. We're gonna immediately, once you take this off, this solenoid, it basically recirculates the gases. We'll immediately just plug that and then you're finished with it. It's now plugged, so the wiring in the plug doesn't get damaged because basically it'll never be used again. We'll put a tape here and then secure it underneath here because it's gonna all get attached kind of like so. After that, we'll basically just start removing all the smog pieces. Plenty of hoses. One of those same clips like the gas tank. This is a perfect example of it. You can just push this tab here, put pressure on the other side, and a lot of the times it'll pop out. You might have to do both as it comes right out like so. This tab here is just a push tab outward like this, and it slides right up. Once you get this kind of free, you gotta move kind of up towards the air box. Come in here. I just pull on these hoses. It doesn't do any damage to anything. This big hose, and then basically have this whole piece removed. That won't go back on the bike at all. While we're at it, we'll just continue with basically removing the other radiator hoses. This is just the top one. All I did is spin it, and it kind of broke the connection on the thermostat. We'll back it up, kind of move it just to the side a little bit. Take your 8mm handle. Again, break them loose. Probably pretty essential to break the coolant temp sensor loose. So it should be a 19mm. So I use the wrench and just break that loose so you can spin it out. We will be reusing this piece. Make sure you keep intact this aluminum crush washer. Make sure it slides on. That will be reused in our piece. Save that for later. You can continue backing out the thermostat. This whole system. So as I removed this, the seals stayed intact. If you want, you can take them out and clean them and then put them back on the coolant outlet piece, but we're basically reusing those seals. It's essential that you reuse those. You didn't get those in your thermostat kit, or your coolant outlet kit, I'm sorry. These bolts will all be basically put to the wayside. You won't use those again. While we're at it, we might as well just connect the pieces together and get them going. So you take your coolant outlet piece. You have the seals perfect. You can slide it directly in. It goes on pretty nicely. There might be an issue of, looks like this one has an issue. Each person, if you ride your bike quite a bit, the exhaust port will build up some exhaust, so you may have to clean it out. So while we're at it, we're just gonna clean that little piece out. Some contact cleaner will help, and a rag. Stick it in the hole and basically move it around kind of in a circular motion, and it'll basically clean out some of that carbon that's built up, because again, we're just basically eliminating that recirculatory gas. So if you clean the seals off, you can do it this way instead. Put the first seal on the coolant outlet port and the second seal on the exhaust port. Slide those pieces just should align pretty easily. It goes on perfectly now. Take your 6x22 bolt and thread that in. I like to use a T-handle to spin these in. I use an inch torque. You can use a foot-pound torque, just as long as you're at 7 foot-pounds or 84 inch-pounds. Just double check the tightness. You're all good to go. You can now slide your radiator hose back on. Just basically work the hose clamp tight. These hose clamps are important to just get snug, but not too tight. You don't want to just like over tighten the hose and kind of pinch it. The next step, so now you're secure, you're pretty much ready to go. This hose, again, we talked about how it'll get all connected and kind of just like taped. I usually just clip this off without clipping any of the electrical sheathing. I'll just clip this tab off because it's pretty much useless. Another kind of useless tab, you can do it a different way. You can kind of move the little piece here and unthread it if you really wanted to save it, but again, I'm going to clip it with my flush cuts. So now you have plenty of room to kind of secure everything together. I secure it with just a little bit of electrical tape because it is going to eventually get kind of tied to the frame. So I just do this connector that we already plugged in a few minutes ago. Just put a little bit of electrical tape on here. You could use a zip tie if you're wanting to. I just think electrical tapes looks a lot cleaner. So your line will basically look like this. I then go under the throttle cables, back kind of the routing it was in, and then back behind the radiator hose, back this way, but underneath the spark plug wire. And this will all just kind of sit kind of nicely, just like so, and it'll get reconnected just like so, and you'll use the tie that's on the this piece here. It'll kind of connect them all together. The stock tie strap. These are really easy. You just pull the tab and it breaks loose. Nice Honda product. So we'll leave this basically sitting like so. We can also remove, there's another hose here that's basically connects to the bottom tube, and that connects to the tank vent. We're going to reuse basically a different tank vent. If you want to keep the stock tank, then you'll probably just use a regular routing motocross tube into the head stay here, from the tank into the head stay. And if you were going to use basically an IMS option, they give you different vents. It's kind of up to you to decide. This hose, when you remove this, it's actually a perfect little access. If you want to come over here, it's really hard to see, but if you go in here, there's this little clamp here. Just back that out. Coolant temperature sensor. That's might as well just keep building. Screw it in. Doesn't need any Loctite. Doesn't need any sealant. Okay, after you get the coolant temperature sensor tight, make sure you have that crush washer in there. It's really important. Again, it's a 19 mil, and I torque it to 18 foot-pounds. That's the Honda torque spec. You can kind of guess, but it's important that this piece seals, or it'll obviously leak coolant. You want to align the push connector to, you'll figure it out basically, but this one's directly backwards. It'll slide on, snap on. You can run basically the hose down, and it kind of just seals the connector nice. And then you're pretty much done. You make sure that you have your hose clamp tight here and your connector here, and these are torqued. Next step, we'll basically take off the 4-way coolant outlet piece. I start with a wrench. It's usually the easiest to break it loose. We've already removed the coolant hoses. You don't necessarily have to, this is a kind of a fun little trick, but you don't have to have it lined up, a T-handle. You can kind of just use it to the side, and it'll help you take the bolts off pretty quickly. Kind of skips on the head, but it won't strip it or damage it as long as you're pretty nice. Okay, so once you remove the 4-way joint outlet piece, this is the piece you'll be returning. You'll have the modified package or piece in your package. Keep these bolts. You're going to reuse these. Flip this over. You're going to reuse this O-ring. If your bike's super old, like if this is in time and this O-ring needs to be replaced, I suggest you use an OEM O-ring part number. Sometimes this piece also will remain sitting exactly like it is. Remove it. Use your new piece that has the threaded bolt in there with the seal, so it's basically blocking off that outlet. You can see the difference. Then you'll place the seal back in here. Sits real nice. I most of the time just slide this piece right into the hose because it'll kind of keep it in place. You can see how it just holds it up. Make sure that seal stays in there. Run the bolts in so they grab the threads. I like to use that same trick I do with the T-handle sideways. Spins in really nice and quick. Snug it up. Again, I'll use my inch torque, 84 inch-pounds. Those are nice and tight now. Slide get this hose out of the way. We're gonna move that soon. Slide both hoses on. Okay, so once you have these hoses tightened, your whole coolant system is basically sealed now, which is perfect. You could actually put your coolant back in. I'm gonna wait till we finish it and then I'll install the coolant, because I like to do one more step, and that's basically move some of the gaps here in the hoses. I actually do it from the other side, and I'll show you now. Okay, so now we're on the left side of the bike, and I just go to the top hose. This actually connects directly to the coolant Y, and all we're doing is just making a few millimeters of play out of it. So I'll loosen this hose clamp, and most likely it'll be stuck on there, so I'm just gonna run this flathead. Again, don't scratch it's not gonna hurt it, but you just don't want to be too abusive to your brand new motorcycle. Break that seal loose, grab the piece down here, and just pull the connection down about 6 millimeters or so, about a 1/4 of an inch, and you still have plenty of clamping surface. The hose goes plenty far down, or the coolant outlet I should say, on the radiator. Re-snug up the hose clamp. And you're finished with this side. We don't want the frame to rub too much on this hose clamp, so if you can, on your bike, just make sure it has a nice, like, small amount of clearance, so you're not going to create rubbing and wear on the frame over time, because friction does do that. Again, while we're here, we can kind of just reanalyze how this the coolant temperature sensor line runs straight underneath the frame, behind the coolant Y, up next to the side of the radiator, and then if you come over here, you have a clamp. Make sure that clamp stays on this coolant overflow hose. Okay, after you get the coolant lines kind of figured out, we're going to basically remove the airbox plugs, or the airbox lines, and then plug the holes. So the first one is this lower one. We pulled off that hose earlier. I use some needle nose, and I just squeeze the tab here, and it comes out pretty easily. You actually use this stock piece that's provided in the kit, and you slide it in and squeeze the stock tab that leaves you there. Once you have the lower plug in, the stock plug, take your top, basically slide over black plug. It goes on real nice. Take your tie wire that's supplied and slide it over. You can also use grip glue underneath. Just make sure you're not really like leaving a big mess. If you don't have tie wire pliers, this kind of gets a little technical, but most people have them for their grips and stuff. The tie wire that's provided is the size is 0.25 millimeter, and then just make sure it's nice and snug. Clip a little tab, bend the tab over, make sure it kind of is clean, and you can also reuse the stock clamp, but I don't think it's as strong for this purpose. You can reuse that if you wanted to. You could actually close the clamp a little bit, bend it, and then slide it over. It'll most likely stay, especially if you use grip glue, but this is a sure way that no issues are going to happen if your bike's somehow backfires or something like that. It has a little bit more created pressure. We just don't want this to pop off and then your bike suck dust essentially. So make sure those plugs are nice and tight and sealed. You can use glue on both of them actually if you wanted, and your airbox plugged basically. Okay, so we have the airbox plugged now. We're gonna start eliminating some overflow tubes and containers. You want to basically just take your fingers here and apply pressure upward, and this piece will just, with enough pressure, will just pop up. We're going to actually use your supplied yellow hose with your connector. You can actually slide this piece right in. Again, one more time, slide it right in. The stock clamp will hold it no problem with the barb fitting. And we can leave this hose just out for now, and we'll end up routing it down towards the bottom of the bikes. You can actually pop this piece into this hose clamp right here, and it'll be happy, and we'll just end up routing this as soon as these containers are gone. Okay, so now we're over to the left side of the bike to remove all this canister, and if you haven't already, but the first step I'd take is basically removing the countershaft cover, the two 8mm bolts. There's one here and one down here. I like to take heat and modify this piece. You can actually replace it with like an RX cover and it'll fit perfectly, but I cut this piece halfway here and then open these up and makes it look kind of racy. Not as big and bulky if you want to remove some of these covers. We actually are going to offer some bolt kits that you can remove these stock plastic covers and it won't leave you with holes in these stock positions. So once you get this, you can see I've never taken this off and the rubber starts coming out. I'm sure yours probably is doing the same. You can remove these bolts here, 8mm bolts. Slide this piece out. Again, you can modify this piece if you want, or you can replace it like an RX piece. So now that we have this out, we're going to basically do the next step, and it's, if you look down here, there's two 10mm bolts, and it basically holds this charcoal canister to the cases. Take your 10mm T-handle, back the bolt out. This will come loose. You still have a few hoses left. Kind of the way they're routed is up in this direction. We'll end up getting rid of those. Once you run this piece down, you can push on this connector here, and this is the other basically solenoid that opens when the computer gets a certain reading. Take your other stock plug, the one that's remaining in your kit, actually has those seals so we don't damage any of the wires and kind of can remain stock. You don't have to this piece just plugs the plug. It doesn't connect the two wires or anything like that. Next step, you'll remove this clip off all the wires if you haven't done it, and then we're going to break this motor mount loose. Basically it's 3 12mm bolts. Reason why we're doing this is so we can get to the intake manifold, and if you guys are struggling with like the tightness of this, you can find your stock torque settings. These are actually 21 foot-pounds, and this one's usually 40. I'll probably do another video about torque settings and how you can make your chassis work a little better. It's kind of like a racier thing, but this bolt's quite long, over 30 mil. You'll know that you can't kind of mess these three up. So once you get this bracket off, you kind of come over here and you're going to be basically pulling this hose out. So we'll pull it off, and the plunger actually comes out easy on this one. Sometimes this piece will stay in and this hose will come off, but that was quite convenient. We'll run this back down here. That all stays off. Then you take this 5x8 small bolt. It's actually got a 3mm head. It's an Allen, 3mm Allen. This is really hard to see, but basically you thread it into the hole that this was left, so it's kind of like a plug. So I'll push it just a little bit and then take my Allen and just thread it in until it stops. And it already has a clamp on it, and it feels really nice. Actually, it threads in really good and creates a really good seal, so you won't have any issues. It's quite hard to see. Okay, so once you basically have the intake manifold plug, we're going to try to get this charcoal canister out. This is your brake switch, your brake light switch, rear brake light switch. You just lift this. There's a small tab under here. You can use a screwdriver if you wanted, and then you'll basically pull back and it'll slide it off the little plastic piece. You can see how that just happened. Now the brake switch is kind of free. Most likely you'll reuse this piece, so as we slide this out, we will notice that this hose is connected, and this is basically the charcoal canister vent hose, and it basically connects to this vent here, and we'll just kind of follow its way out to get rid of it. Can't really damage it if you just yank on it nicely, but so all the electrical connectors are now disconnected, and the hose from the other side, this is the tank vent hose. The charcoal canister comes out. Once it comes out, you'll have a bracket to use down here on the frame, and just for practice purposes for you guys, so you can see it, I'll reattach it. We'll slide the electrical connector actually back on the plastic piece here. That way you don't have any problems with your brake switch. I also offer a banjo bolt brake switch that will connect into this connector, and you can route this wire up this way, kind of away from the exhaust, and get rid of the brake switch, the stock brake switch, if you're interested. Okay, the last thing is we're going to remove this oil overflow tank, and it's just this small 8 or 10 mil bolt. I'm sorry. Use a wrench. Use your fingers to slide the thing out. Another reason we basically take the motor mount out, so you have some room to get to this little tank. As the bolt comes out, the tank wants to slide out. We pulled the hose out from the other side already. It's just caught on the other side of the frame. This was once connected to the air box. So that's basically your oil overflow. You don't have to use that. You don't have to reconnect anything in here. You just unbolt it. And then your next step is basically to resecure your zip tie here. Slide it back that way. Okay, so once we've got all the containers removed, these pieces are tight. We have this wire kind of dangling. You can secure it to the actual brake switch if you'd like. With, again, you can use like a zip tie or some electrical tape. It looks kind of nice just like that. Or you can run it up here and secure it to the kickstand switch if you're using an L, and you won't have that kickstand switch on an X. But you can also zip tie it to the frame up here. Anything you'd like to do with it is probably okay, as long as it looks kind of nice and out of the way. Connect it to this wire also if it's out of the way. It's just a dummy plug now. After you get the plugs all secured, we're basically going to put the countershaft cover back on. You want to make sure this piece slides over the chain and kind of sits loosely. If you try to slide it both of the pieces on, a lot of times that piece will bind and you'll bend it. So I always put the bolt through to to the bottom piece and kind of line up the holes. Now basically opened up the whole area in your motor, and you get your connectors all dialed. And so if you're riding an X, I forgot to mention, you won't have this brake switch. And then the hose we connected earlier, I like to pull it over to this side. You can actually zip tie it. If you're riding an L, you can zip tie it to this bracket, just a real loose zip tie to hold it. Or if this bracket's not even here, you can run a zip tie through the threads and then run the hose basically down past the shock. And then I actually like to run it backwards up towards the skid plate down here. It's the stock skid plates and under the shifter, so you can kind of see if there's ever any like oil flow down there. It'll tell you whether you've like overfilled your oil or something like that, rather than just going all over the ground. But yeah, that's the general routing of the hose. You can kind of make your decision on how you want it. You can shorten the hose so it only goes down past the shock. It's up to you. Just cut it whichever direction you want. Okay, we're almost done with the whole install. Now we're going to fill the coolant back up. It's important because some of these lines are smaller. The coolant takes a little longer to get through the whole system. So right now it basically seems like it's full. So I'm going to put the cap on. There's still actually this much coolant inside the container. We're going to run the bike after we put the tank on, and probably recheck that later once it cools off to refill it. Okay, we're back to installing the tank. We again got to keep the seat cradle back so it stays out of the way. We're going to run the fuel hose on. Make sure that green piece is pulled back but not off. Kind of fights you. Slide it over. It's kind of a technical job, but I always keep the rubber piece kind of laying down and slide the hose on. And then pop the green piece in. Use your plastic piece. Slide it on over. Kind of move it back and forth to make sure it's secure. Connect your electrical connector here. Power to the fuel pump. This piece is pretty bindy. That piece pops right back in. And you can lay your fuel tank, whether it's an IMS or stock. This one's stock. You can modify this hose. Actually take this out and you run it straight down into here. You actually don't have to modify it much. It'll go all the way down to the front fender if you'd like, the stock setting. So obviously replace the 2 bolts. So now we're just going to reinstall the cradle. Most of you guys are going to probably use a different ECU. This bike actually does run okay with an exhaust and all the recirculating gases and all that stuff plugged up. It's a little lean still, but we'll just slide this piece back in through the rubber. Cradle's on, and then we'll just go to installing the exhaust and the plastics. Earlier I talked about replacing the exhaust gasket. If you're putting again the stock same muffler on and header, most of the time it'll find itself. I do suggest replacing it if you have one, if you're going to put a new exhaust on or anything like that. Alright guys, we got it all installed. Hopefully your bike will run a lot better without those recirculating gases. I want to thank you for purchasing the Champion Adventures Outlet Kit. I want to make sure that you put this in the supplied package and get it shipped back to us so you can get your $40 rebate. And if you guys want to ride dirt bikes in Baja or maybe in California, somewhere around here, hit up championadventures.com and we can ride dirt bikes and have fun, and maybe I can teach you a few things. Maybe you could teach me a few things. Have a good one. Thanks.